Our speaker tonight is Dr. Linda Lockhart. She got her PhD and MS from Ohio University in Mass Communication, Journalism, Public Relations. And she also got a BA from Marietta College in Public Relations and Business Management. And then she spent a number of years working both at OU and at Washington State. But then Marietta College was lucky enough to get her back in 2018. And now she's been a faculty member in the Department of Communications there. So tonight she's going to be talking to us about liquid boundaries, pro and anti-slavery sentiments from the pages of Marietta newspapers from 1801 to 1863. So thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to go get her the slide. Going to go ahead and switch over here. Do a screen share and always come home. They just keep calling me back. But fortunately, that's the roots of my research for tonight's program. I was an undergrad student at Marietta College. Sorry about that. Hi, folks online. I didn't want to stay out of the picture. In my 30s. And so I had a busy life. I was, raising kids and working full time. And I thought, I need to do some research that I don't have to run all over the place to do. I knew they had a great special collection. So I went and just started asking some questions and talking to Linda Showwater, who was there at that time already. And she said, well, we have these newspapers. We have this wonderful collection of newspapers, mostly on microfilm, but an almost full set of newspapers from early Marietta. And I said, well, that sounds promising since I was a journalism student, right? And so I started digging into it. I've laid it aside for a few years. And when I thought about doing this program, I got that all out and I started reading and I went, I remember why I was so interested in this. We are so fortunate to have the kinds of historical resources that we have. So let's get started. First of all, looking at making sure I'm not pushing anything off here that I shouldn't. Let's see. Okay, we're up there. You all know, I'm sure, about Marietta, that the town was settled by an educated, cultured population, right? So it isn't, ridiculous to think that they would want to know what was happening. They had become self-sufficient from the time they settled until about 1800, pretty well self-sufficient, but very honestly, there were still things that needed to come from the East. Things like glass and steel and books and news, because they were in the frontier. And so luckily, in 1801, only the fourth newspaper in what later became Ohio was launched in Marietta, Marietta's first newspaper. And I get the names mixed up, so if I mess up, there are a lot of them, please forgive me. But in 1801, the, let's see if I have the name here. I think it's the Ohio Gazette and Virginia Herald, and the Territorial Virginia Herald. It was bigger than the newspaper itself. The newspaper itself was an 11 by 17 sheet, which, we print on now, right? And 4 pages of that. That was as large as it ever was. But it was news. It was news from the East. It was news about what was going on in other places. It was very little news about local affairs. that was normal for papers, especially on the frontier, because you could talk to your neighbors and find out what was going on locally, right? You didn't need to waste the space or the time to read that, but you didn't know what was going on back east or in the world. So, as I said, a press came into Marietta. That was probably a pretty exciting time. I have here a picture of a press that would be somewhat similar to what came. However, okay.
See if I can minimize that a little bit
Okay.
off to the side. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
It's okay. That's okay. I'm liking this because I'm usually the person on the back end doing the tech stuff. So while we were all virtual with the castle, I was the person in the room kind of making things happen like that. So it's nice not to be doing that. This is a stand press. It was about 1800. This was created. This is actually iron. The press that came to Marietta was wood. This was a little advanced for what we did. It gives you some idea of what it looked like. It truly was labor to print a newspaper on this type of press, because you had to ink the type, set the type, ink the type, pick it up, put a piece of paper in, pull the lever down, print the sheet, right? Pull it up, take it out, put another sheet in. It was really a two-person operation. Anyway, so they were welcomed. They welcomed this press. It was moved into the north side of Washington Street between Front and Second, and production of the paper began. That's where we're going to start this research. The Ohio Gazette, like I said, was the first in Marietta, the fourth in Ohio. There were two earlier in Cincinnati area and one in Chillicothe. Of course, we weren't Ohio yet at that time, right? We don't have copies. Marietta College doesn't have copies. There aren't extant copies of most of this early Ohio Gazette newspaper. But we're fortunate enough that in the 1860s, an editor of a Marietta paper at that time went back and reviewed copies he had and gave us an overview, a review of what might have been there. So part of what he had to say had to do with what the content was. It was a lot of ads, a lot of ads. The front page was all ads, right? But he said there was very little, as I said, very little local news, but a lot from other places. However, the editors, the first editors, Elijah Backus and Willis Silliman, did very early on, and we know this from Ronnie Stimson, acknowledge that their readership was from both sides of the river. And that's where we get the liquid boundaries for this particular program. We all know this, that the river separates very distinctly what was then Virginia and what would soon become Ohio. It was a very definite geographical boundary. But at that time, this side of the river, slavery was legal, right? And in practice. On this side of the river, it was not. The reason I did this research was to see if there was, viewing this as kind of a microcosm of the North and the South, to see what types of sentiments we could pick up from the press. Oftentimes, newspapers will reflect what is important to the folks that are reading it, or what the editors want the people to think is important. So by reading those things, we can actually get a view of what it was like during that period. Historian William Hunsaker actually called it the minutia. The minutia reported in frontier newspapers, he said, provides this microscopic part of history that we may not otherwise see. So here's where we're going to go. This is the recognition by the editors of the Ohio Gazette in their very first issue that breathing the same air, having the same wants, being capable of the same pleasures, talking the same language, living under the same national government, what is there to limit or divide our affections? A river divides us. Fortunately or unfortunately, there was something else that divided those two, and I mentioned it. It was slavery. Stimson actually, when he reviewed this, commented on that, and he said the only thing that ever created anything of a spirit of discord between those residing on this side or that side of the river, whose kindred branches we inhabit, is slavery. As the river flows, as it is a liquid boundary between slave and non-slave, what I wanted to see is, did indeed the sentiment flow? Did it change? Did it ebb and flow between the sides or even in our community? Marietta was a media-rich community. Couldn't be surprising. And between 1801 and 1863, I chose those dates, by the way, because 1801 was the first newspaper. 1863, Virginia turned into West Virginia, right? And that changed the whole complexion of the slave, non-slave territory. But between within that period, there were at least 21 newspapers in Marietta. And that's the ones we can track. There were a lot of newspapers. Now, we have to keep in mind that the 19th century was a different period for journalism, although, I don't know, sometimes it's similar now. Newspapers were by intention partisan. So you often had two opposing parties, each with their own newspaper in a town. That was not unusual. Matter of fact, the parties, the politicians paid for those newspapers. That's what supported them. There also was nothing of this being neutral or non-biased or fair and balanced. It was a newspaper had its particular agenda. Usually that was set by the editor, because often the editor was the printer and the writer and the publisher and maybe the ad salesman. So it was definitely, the tone was set usually by the editors. So that was a lot of newspapers to go through in that period. And I was like, I'm not up to this. So what I did is I looked at, I missed this. This is the Ohio Gazette, one of the early issues. This is actually from 1808. But you can see what the sheet looked like. The list of newspapers I was talking about, here's a list just in that period. And like I said, there may be some that are missing from this, to be very honest, that for whatever reason, we don't have any remnants of. And oftentimes those overlapped a little bit, but many times what you will see is that one would go out of business, sell the press and perhaps the assets, the customers for the ads, sell that to the next person who would pick it up, change its name, and keep printing. Now, they sometimes would change editorial content, the way they approach things, but I wasn't up to reading all of these. So instead, what I did is I did some research and found out that if we go from the 1801 Ohio Gazette and we trace down through, we track and say that became this, and it was sold to such and such. And then here the press was auctioned. We can actually trace, with some kind of shady spots, but a lineage from the 1801 Ohio Gazette to today's Marietta Times, interestingly. So if you take out those that weren't in that lineage, you narrow down a great deal the newspapers I looked through. You can't do keyword searches on old newspapers unless they've been digitized. So I actually took it on myself to go to special collections. I sat down at a microfilm machine and I read every copy that was available within that period. Now, that sounds worse than it was, right? Because some of them were weeklies, so you didn't have, there were missing copies, but still it was a lot to read through. But that's how I felt I could get the flavor for what was being said about slavery. All right, so we now have how I got to the research. My cards are sticking together. I mentioned that. Let's find out what I found, or at least let me share a little of that with you. I took what I found and I started putting it into a timeline. Here's this article and this article and this article. And there began to be a picture emerge that there were periods during which slavery and freedom were addressed in certain ways. The prevalence was a certain, toward a certain example. For example, the very first period that this broke down into, 1801 to 1819, really represented in the newspapers slavery from the economic proposition, right? It was almost all about the cost of slaves, the reward for runaway slaves, the production, etc. I say almost because truthfully, there was one exception to this. When the Ohio Gazette came to the end of its life, it was actually sold. And I guess I missed this one. Before it actually moved from being the Ohio Gazette, this is the type of thing you might have found in it. The economic data about the number of slaves that were imported and how that had changed from year to year. That kind of thing was not at all unusual. The cost of slaves was not unusual to see listed as well. But when that paper in I believe it was 1810, 11, thank you. Yeah, right there. It was auctioned because it failed to pay its debts, and it was replaced by the Western Spectator. The Western Spectator was edited by a gentleman named Caleb Emerson, who was very opinionated, very outspoken, said what he believed and printed what he believed. This was, like I said, kind of an exception in comparison to the rest of this period, in that he actually printed essays, and this actually shows one, essays on slavery to bring forward this issue so that it could be talked about. Because before this, many folks said, oh, we don't want to agitate our readers across the river. We don't want to upset people, right? And either lose readership or lose ad dollars. So rather than do that, we'll just kind of avoid it. Caleb Emerson, like I said, was kind of the exception to that rule. However, it only lasted for 2 years. He printed from 1811 to 1813. One journalism historian, which is my area of history, is journalism and mass media, actually stated he believes that it's the first time in Ohio that the subject was discussed in depth in print in this way. But if we get away from that, those 2 years, those 2 golden years, this is more what you would see in this early period. Runaway slaves, $300 reward for Jack, Rose, and John. That's a lot of money, especially when you consider, if you look at Williamsport, which is now Williamstown, I believe land sold for 12.5 cents an acre. Unless it was cleared, then it was $7. It was like 6 cents for a chicken. $300 was a lot of money as a reward. Some of these ads, there is another one, I don't believe it's this one, where it said, and all reasonable costs. So if you had captured and returned these slaves, not only would you get the reward, you would be able to collect anything you had spent to be able to do that. In these ads, you oftentimes will also see that there was a difference in the reward if you were, and most of these were from Virginia. If you captured and turned them in and you were from Virginia, it was lower. If you captured them in Ohio, it was usually about double. So it was not unusual to be maybe $50 to return a single slave. That's a blank card. We don't that one. Wrapping up this period on economic, the importance of the economic impact of slavery. Historian Wilbur Seifert actually stated it really, many unprincipled men along the Ohio River found manhunting exciting and profitable business. So the newspaper, again, like I said, keep in mind, was at this point addressing both sides of the river. They depended on readership from both. So they were trying to keep things calm. Okay, the next period, there are, by the way, I divided into 6 periods, this research. We're going to address 3 in more depth. 3 of them, I'll give you a little bit of background on the last 3, mainly because they could each be a program in and of themselves, which you'll find out when I get to that. So 1819 to 1833, the slavery debate is starting to emerge, both nationally, but also locally. The things are growing. The population is growing. As a matter of fact, there. I have some numbers here. I didn't let you know in 1813, go back one. In 1813, the Western Spectator turned into the American Friend. That was the next newspaper up, edited by David Everett. He avoided the issue of slavery completely. Just matter of fact, he edited out references to the word slavery. There was I believe it was a poem that was run in the newspaper, and there were 2 lines that referred to slavery. He deleted them and put asterisk in the place of those lines, rather than even mentioning the word. And he noted, we have readers on both sides. Catch up. Growing pains. So in 1819, 2 events took place. One national and one more regional. In 1819, there was a call for a convention to rewrite the Ohio Constitution. The people of Marietta, and this info is coming from the newspapers, by the way. The people of Marietta, many were really concerned about that. They were afraid that if it were rewritten, it would include actually legally being able to include slavery in the state, even though that had been written in that it would not. And that was, by the way, kind of a close call on the first Constitution. So that kind of got agitated locally, right? Oh, we're concerned about this. At the same time, nationally, this is when the Missouri question came up, where Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, but it would knock out the balance of slave to free states, right, in the legislature. And there was a lot of discussion in other newspapers that got imported into the newspapers at Marietta. Much of the news, by the way, in newspapers at that time were clipped from other newspapers to include. But those two things really kind of dominated or led the coverage during this period. When the election day came for the referendum, or the call for a convention rather, on the Ohio Constitution, the vote was 26 in favor, 880 against. That was reported in the newspaper. So they did talk about that at least. Without going into a lot of detail, what was covered nationally in the local papers, the Missouri, as you probably know, question ended in the Missouri Compromise. Finally, where Missouri came in as a slave state and Maine came in as a free state at the same time. They were linked. That meant the balance was maintained. However, what it did was it kicked the can down the road. It just basically said, okay, we don't have to think about this right now, but they would in the future. After that, let's see, the American Friend, which was the current paper being published, printed this poem, which kind of gave us a little bit of foresight into the next period as it was coming up. If you can read this, you can read that. But the last stanza is, "Hail Marietta, thou my native town. I'll sing thy praise to freedom there is known. For freedom there is known. No petty tyrants tread thy peaceful streets. No mourning slave the passing stranger meets. Blessed be thy name while fair Ohio's waves shall part thy borders from the land of slaves." Ohio's waves, Ohio River's waves, parting the border from what now was being more and more referred to as the land of slaves, our neighbors across the river. Part of that had to do with there was a lot of growth in the number of slaves. Between 1810 and 1820, Virginia, the Virginia area of Virginia went from having 450 slaves, I'm sorry, to 852 10 years later. At that point, there was one slave for every white resident of the region of Wood County primarily. So there was this growing fear, because also in the newspapers at that time nationally, we were starting to see these uprisings and fear of violence, fear of the number of Blacks, right, increasing. It was also, to people in Marietta, it was kind of like reality, in that there was a slave market in Parkersburg where slaves were auctioned, sometimes like to settle an estate or if to pay off somebody's debts at the courthouse, right down at the mouth of the Little Kanawha. And there were these, like I said, these reports of uprisings. Even in Ohio, the newspapers were reprinting news from other parts of Ohio that were blatantly racist. Sandusky, for example, was really concerned and was trying to prevent Blacks from, they had bought land there, and they were trying to prevent them from actually setting up households there, because they feared that they would become so respectable in the community that they would then marry into with their children. So they were afraid of the respectability, not of the violence. Anyway, so you can see in the newspapers this tension continuing to build locally as well as nationally and regionally. In 1823, we changed newspapers again. The American Friend became the American Friend and Marietta Gazette. They loved long names. They had small papers and long names, I guess. I don't know. Royal Prentice became the editor at that time. And, or I'm sorry, not became the editor. He was the editor for since 1814 of the American Friend. In 1823, when it changed names, he remained as editor, but his brother, Jennison, joined him. And they increased the size of the newspaper again, which meant more articles, more space to fill. And you start seeing more articles about, as I said, the concern of the number of Blacks in the country. But interestingly, and Royal Prentice, first of all, I love that name. Isn't that a great editor's name? Royal Prentice. Anyway, he really didn't avoid printing things that might be controversial, but he and his brother, not too long after they changed the name, really took a step outside that kind of shifted things. Let's see if I have this up. The story they put in the paper, now, we don't know if this is what really happened, of course, because they could have written this themselves, was that two written articles, anonymous articles, showed up at their office. Their office was on 5th Street, and with a note saying, please publish this. The oddity was those articles were actually in favor of slavery and were extolling the virtues and the superiority of the southern states and how they were progressing because of slavery. The two Prentice brothers hesitated, but then decided to print these. And I had to look this up because I don't know Latin, but Scipio Africanus is how it was signed. It was anonymous, as I said, but there were several in this series. There were also responses. One in particular, or one person in particular, wrote as no Scipio Africanus, and there became this debate in print. It was really unusual because it was starting to show both sides, show these views that not just, well, here's what the editor thinks, but here's a back and forth going on. More and more, the newspaper began to refer to our Virginia neighbors as kind of that culprit, that north-south culprit. More and more, they began to turn to what solutions are there, especially political solutions they were looking for. Although the American Friend continued to portray Marietta as staunchly anti-slavery, they did begin to represent those neighbors, as I said, as the land of slaves more. at the same time, because it was kind of we need to do something. From I think it was from the Niles Register, a reprint said, so the cry is, we must do something. What can we do? Well, in Marietta, one of the things, there were several things being done, but was Washington County created a colonization society. If you're not familiar with that movement, basically it was a movement to create a colony on the west coast of Africa so that Blacks could be shipped there to live and reduce the numbers here in this country. This actually started with David Putnam Jr., which you probably all know that name, possibly at least. And over several years, they finally became official and were associated with the National Society. So they were trying to start finding things, and these kind of things began showing up in the newspaper, where before they would not have. It would have been like, okay, that happened, but we're not going to print it. In 1833, the Prentice brothers sold the American Friend and Gazette to John Delafield and Edward Nye, and I believe Edward Nye lived in this house, if I am correct. He died in this house, if I remember correctly. Edward Nye was the editor of the Marietta Gazette. And once again, they increased the size of the newspaper. As editor, he featured more local news than had been in any of the previous newspapers. He started talking about what was going on here, not just what was going on across the country. And this is a quote from Editor Nye, except I can't read it. The editor is not unaware that the periodical press is a most powerful instrument in the movement of the direction and oft-time, perhaps too oft, the excitement of public opinion, of sentiment and feeling, that the results of its actions must be important and extensive for good or for evil. So this is, again, if you look at journalism in the 19th century, especially, there was a true feeling by journalists, by editors, by publishers, that the press actually shaped opinion. And they specifically tried to do so. Back to that partisanship, right? They were in the business of trying to get people to think a certain way. And I was just acknowledging that indeed they were aware of that. So, we now have gotten to the point that we're beyond just economics. There's this growing problem that people are becoming more and more aware of through what's coming out in the newspapers. We get to the third period, the last one I'm going to talk about in depth, 1833 to 1845. The question was, what can we do? We need to do something. What can we do? Well, this was a really active period in Marietta for reform. There were things going on, such as women's rights were starting to bubble up. The temperance union was active. But in this particular case, for this particular topic, it had to do with, they called themselves anti-slavery, which usually was shorthand for abolitionist, not always, but usually. And then an abolitionist had kind of a bad name as rabble rousers and, getting people all excited about that. And so there were anti-abolitionist societies to counter the anti-slavery society. In the newspaper, early in this period, we see both of those sides, so to speak, of the issue represented. They would submit the proceedings from their meetings and have them printed. There would be stories. There was a story about the Anti-Abolition Society wrote a letter to the Anti-Slavery Society telling them they should not meet. That I'm not sure why. Anyway, it was kind of this fervent letter that was delivered to the secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society, which was a Marietta College student, who knew that it was coming and knew what was in it. And this was all told in the newspaper, and would not touch it. So he grabbed it with tongs, which insulted, right, the Anti-Abolition Society, which then had a meeting and went on about, how disrespectful they were in the way that they acted. Again, this is not something that earlier that type of thing would not have been reported in the paper. So you're starting to see that activity showing up in print. Again, part of it to influence, part of it to inform. It so happened that in 1835, Theodore Weld, who was a very fervent anti-slavery, shorthand, minister and educator who went around lecturing, right, and stirring up, so to speak, getting people to think about things. He was, and Scott, I know, was aware of this. He came to Marietta to lecture. He had been run out of other cities in Ohio with rotten eggs, and just the lecture shut down because people were so over the top. Boy, this again sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, but he came to Marietta. He had planned to speak at Marietta College, and Marietta College said, it's not safe. We don't think it's prudent for you to be in our buildings. So it so happened that the library gave him space to lecture. However, with the stipulation that he was only allowed to lecture during the daytime because it wasn't safe to do that so at night. There are several stories of that type. Yeah, let's see, where are we here? Is that? Interestingly, at that time, part of the reason we may know a lot of these stories is, again, in 1836, Caleb Emerson became, remember from the Western Spectator, the outspoken anti-slavery person? He became editor again. And he began truly publishing a lot of information locally about what was going on. He actually hadn't been with the newspaper very long. It was not owned by him originally. He was just editing. And the owner, the publisher, was really hesitant because, well, that's controversial and it's going to stir up people and excite things, and maybe we shouldn't put that in the newspaper. Caleb Emerson was kind of like, yeah, we should. So he just bought the newspaper so he could print what he wanted. He actually went back, and things he had written the prior year, he started to publish because, again, they were very direct. And part of this is, as this quote shows, from 1836, he was very much a proponent of freedom of the press and being able to, that people should be able to say what they needed to say. Anyway, so he didn't stick with it long, just like the Western Spectator. In a year, he sold the paper. It went from all of this, detail and this information. So we were getting what's happening with reform, what's happening with views on slavery, to the editor being Isaac Maxson, who renamed it again, the Marietta Gazette and Washington County Agriculturist. And he changed the content completely. There was no local event, very little local event stuff. There was a lot of farm news in it. He actually specifically addressed early on, we do not intend to meddle with abolitionism, either for or against. And he made that promise and he stuck with it. He would not print things that either of those societies submitted and asked, like proceedings or whatever it is they might want to have. But even though it wasn't being discussed, the conflict was still continuing. I mean, it was still going on in Marietta. We just can't track it right at that time through this newspaper. Until I will say that Maxon did include, he almost couldn't avoid including news that was national, right? As I told you, much of the news would come from other newspapers and they would include it. So he kind of had to, and a lot of that at that time was bubbling up with the same types of conflicts. Anyway, in 1839, some competition appeared. This is one of the few times where we see two newspapers in that lineage operating head to head at the same time. So the Marietta Intelligencer, edited by Beeman Gates, began publishing in 1839, and for 4 years, both of those newspapers published. It was kind of interesting that the Agriculturist, when the Intelligencer first was established, wrote some editorial about, people were saying that the Intelligencer is going to eat up, our newspaper and blah, 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 all appendages of it, blah, 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 blah. And what happened? In 4 years, that's exactly what happened. The Intelligencer basically took over both newspapers, melded them into one, and went forward from there. Now, the interesting thing about Beeman Gates, let's see here if I've missed a slide. Yeah, about Beeman Gates is that he took a very different approach in expanding the content of the Intelligencer over previous newspapers, including the slavery and anti-slavery news, those conflicts. He restored very detailed local news to the newspaper. He steered away from harsh partisanship and actually preferred to present factual, both sides, both candidates, if it happened to be an election type of thing. He hired correspondents in various cities to send news to the newspaper, and that was pretty early for that to be happening in 1839, I believe I said, 1844 this is. He traveled as well, and he would write from where he was traveling. So if he was somewhere, including covering slavery, covering different pieces of the conflict, and he promised to, quote, speak of slavery and its enormities in just as plain terms as language will enable us to. So he early on made this promise that he would include what was going on with slavery. Interestingly, for me, this is very interesting because the research I did later for my PhD, for my dissertation, had to do with what role journalism and the editor, A.W. Campbell of the Wheeling Intelligencer, played in West Virginia becoming a state, because he had quite a role. That whole newspapers influenced people. And back in 1844, Beeman Gates already was recognizing this shift in our neighbors in Virginia. He noticed and recognized there was a growing division between the western part of the state and Virginia, that the population was growing, but slavery was going down. In 1830, the population of Wood County was about 1,500. By 1840, it was 8,000. The slaves in that same area went from 877 down to 624 in the same period. So we could kind of start seeing this shift. And as you can see from his quote, we believe the time is not far distant when Virginia will be divided. This was about the same time, by the way, West Virginia was getting to a point where there was a rift internally. About 1850, they went through this, we're going to split. And then they came to a compromise and they said, oh, okay, we'll kiss and make up. So he was starting to see that as well. I think in this period, more than in any other, we see the significance that an editor made in what and how the issue of slavery was covered in the newspapers at that time. It doesn't mean things weren't happening when it wasn't being covered. It means it wasn't being shared. So, and like I said, that was more the call of the editor usually than anything else. Okay, so let's wrap up a very quick with these last three. Because like I said, each of these could almost be a program of its own, but they're interesting enough, so I'll tease you with them. How's that? 1845 to 47. I titled this Agitation of Sectional Issues. So we've talked about the boundary, right? The physical, geographical boundary, the boundary of sentiment. In 1845, there was a case where there was some slaves that escaped from the Parkersburg area, I think from Washington's Bottom, if I'm not mistaken, crossed the river at night to about where Little Hocking would be, between Belpre and Little Hocking. And the slave owners had sent folks to the other side and captured them on Ohio soil. Well, actually in the water, right? I don't know how far in the water. And that's where the question came up of where is the boundary drawn? Because Virginia owned the river, but there wasn't a very, very clear demarcation of where that ownership ended. There was in some language, but it was debated. This actually went to court. It was in court for a few years before it was settled that the low water mark at that time was the state boundary. And I believe, if I remember this, I didn't review this, if I remember correctly, and any of you folks who have studied this, let me know if I'm wrong, that it was decided that the slaves had been captured on the Ohio side of the low water mark. And so it was not legal to actually have done so, to have held them. But yeah, it was a huge nationally covered case. And it kind of took over the news about slavery in this local area at that time. So like I said, there's a lot that can go into that really interesting case. Here we do have for the from Beam & Gates again, just a little quote about how it's rapidly becoming the question of the age, how much greater this conflict was coming forward. The other two sections, that's the last slide, but the other two sections in the research, I divided into slavery, takes flight. And it had to do with escape. That That was the chapter to itself, which was really very much about the Underground Railroad. However, remember the Underground Railroad was secretive. So there wasn't a lot specifically covered in that. There were a lot of things you can look at that point to some things happening and some stories of things happening. And then the final one is the irrepressible conflict, which really talks about the days leading up to the start of the Civil War. Not that those aren't interesting, but I don't want to keep you here all night. But I will end with a story. It is the way I started the actual report, but I didn't start it tonight this way. So I think it was on April the 17th of 61, if I remember correctly. The newspaper that was publishing at that time had an article about the firing on Fort Sumter. This like news, right? Shocking news. And because, remember, I talked about the land of slaves and not being sure about the sentiments across the river, there was some question in Marietta about what was going to happen with the people across the river. Virginia had just declared that they would secede with, and I bet Scott knows this better than I do, 7 other states at that point.
Yeah, they were one of the last.
Yes, they were. They put it off forever and ever and ever, and they finally came to a decision. So that was also, had just been in the paper, and the people in Marietta weren't really sure what was going to happen. Now it's April, you've been here, it can be really hot or really cold, but it was really cold at this time. Wind blowing off the river, it was still wintry, and this big group gathered down near the river in the morning because they wanted to see what was going to happen. What they were watching for was the people in Williamstown to see what flag they were going to raise. Were they going to raise the Union flag or the Confederate flag, or a flag that denoted that they weren't sticking with the Union? Interestingly, of course, the Stars and Stripes went up. The newspaper reported this in detail. Cheers, people throwing hats in the air on the Marietta side. They actually had drug a cannon down to the river, and they're firing the cannon off in celebration. It was a wonderful way to end the end of my study as well, because it was kind of like, okay, all the problems weren't gone. Obviously, there were still another 5 years of war to come or so. But it was that resolution across that liquid boundary of, we want to work together. We want to be neighbors. We are on our path to do that. So I'll leave you with that, even in sometimes right now, things just get a little overwhelming. Maybe someday we'll walk down to the river, we'll watch for, I don't know, some sign and shoot our cannons off. Any questions that on any of this or other parts of, do you want to change this? Well, you're going to do that. Yes. That's a good question. The question is, were there in the research, did I find any newspapers coming from the Black community or sentiment, particularly from the Black community? I didn't specifically see any Black press in Marietta. There were in other parts of Ohio at that point, just not necessarily in Marietta. There were at times some sentiments, but most of it was from the white man's perspective, because that's who the editors were, right? So they were telling the story from their perspective. It was not necessarily ordinary at that time to go out and look for other people's input. So sadly, I haven't, but that would be worth doing some more research to find, looking specifically for that as well. Other questions or comments? I don't think I covered everything that well. I'm sure there are some other things to ask about. Yes. Yes. The question is, did they ever get newspapers from outside coming in, either from people who were traveling and brought them in or whatever? Honestly, newspapers from outside were a typical way. There was like an exchange that newspapers got their news up until about the 1860s, to be very honest, late 50s or 60s. But so they did get newspapers coming in, some of them on a regular basis, because they had the exchanges set up so that they would get particular newspapers. Sometimes people would just bring them in and, you know, for whatever reason, and they'd get their hands on them. They would actually clip, you know, they would take the news out of that newspaper, they'd reset it. And most of the time when you see those, they will either have a date line of the city where the news came from. Sometimes it will actually acknowledge the publication that it came from. So that's very typical with 19th century news, like I said, up through the Civil War even, that's true. What else? Yeah.
Especially when you're getting questions. You get very partisan newspapers, there's
Yes.
newspapers, and it doesn't take like 20 seconds of reading to figure out what political party is there, doing all sorts of advertising, and particularly the slavery issue is very.
Yes. Yeah. And very honestly, at that period as well, it becomes very difficult once the war had been declared. It becomes very difficult in many areas to find opposition newspapers. So, and I did a little bit of this in this study, but I did more in my Wheeling study. I looked at newspapers from both sides of the partisanship, right, from the same area, to compare them. Once you get to the war, you can't find most Republican, you can't find a Republican newspaper in the South. They just don't exist. The ones that did got burnt out or shut down for the most part, or Whig. Many of them were Whigs because the Republican Party had just started at that point. And oftentimes you couldn't find a Democratic newspaper in the same city as a Republican one. So yeah, it gets pretty crazy once you truly get into that. Yes. Yeah. One of the quotes that I had up here from Caleb Emerson, where he was responding about people being able to print things, and have we lost our I forget how he puts it, but lost our humanity. That was spurred because there was a newspaper office in Cincinnati, I believe it was, that had been attacked for supposedly supporting abolitionists, and had been torn apart, basically. So yeah, that it became pretty violent. Yes.
Wasn't Thomas Stewart a publisher to become a president? Thomas Stewart was it on Putnam Street, and his house, the basic firm.
Yeah, they burned literally out.
And it very well, the question was Thomas Ewart, a newspaper person? And I didn't come across that specifically. It may have been that he was an owner, but not an editor, because I was mainly tracking editors, right? Or it may have been that he was associated with one of those newspapers that weren't in this study. So of those 21, there were like 10 I didn't look, 10 or 11 I didn't look at. So it may very well have been. Yeah. Many of the editors at that point were lawyers, which I always found really interesting. So, yeah. Wig, it would have been.
And the ones who were for slavery was the Democrats. Is that correct?
I didn't specifically look at that. It would. I'm sorry. Thank you, Scott. The question was, it sounded as if the abolitionists were primarily Whigs and the anti-abolitionists were primarily Democrats. And my answer is I didn't necessarily look specifically for that, but that kind of makes sense that that would be the partisan side of that, right? Because the anti-abolitionists, it was kind of a spectrum, right? So it wasn't necessarily they supported slavery, but they didn't think that abolishing it was the right way to go about doing away with it. They were much, and some did. Some were like, yes, we support slavery, but that would kind of make sense. But I didn't specifically look at that. Yeah, and like I said, especially early on, as it was less about it was discussed more as an economic issue, a political issue, and an issue of fear or threat as much as anything else. And there is some discussion of it as a moral issue, but not a lot, to be very honest. Yes.
I guess we were saying,
the question is, were there newspapers being printed in Williamstown and Parkersburg at the same time? There were definitely Parkersburg newspapers. Part of the water line, the boundary marking thing I talked about, there was like a feud between the Marietta newspaper and the Parkersburg Gazette at that time that was quite interesting, where they were kind of like printing back and forth at each other. It was kind of like social media, except on paper, right? Yeah, it was really slow, social media. But it was very much that same attitude where they were specifically calling each other out and calling each other names. And I'm not sure about Williamstown at that time. It wouldn't surprise me if there were, but I didn't look at those. I thought that would be an interesting next step to this, is actually to be comparing it to the West Virginia newspapers at that time and what they were covering. One more question? Anything online, Drew? Yeah, Wes.
You find in this Annabelle, this previous here, any women at all in not necessarily as writers, but in reference to activities by women related to this particularly, but
right
beyond that.
The question is, did I find women that were part of newspapers, either as writers or running things or whatever during this. The answer to that is I didn't with this particular study, but I also wasn't looking specifically for that. So I may very well look something that might have indicated that. I do know in my Wheeling Intelligencer research, I found it quite interesting that, and this was in the, let's see, he took, A.W. Campbell took over as editor of that paper in 1855 or 56. And he actually had at least 3 women who wrote regularly for the paper. They weren't identified in the paper. One was his sister, one was his mother, and and one was, oh gosh, and why is her name? She was what's her first name? She became a very famous author.
Oh, yes. Yes.
No, that doesn't sound right. Oh, it will be Google. Go home and look that up. Right? She wrote Life in the Iron Mills. Rebecca Davis. That's it. Yeah. That was in the late 1850s. So it wasn't real early. There were some indications that there were letters that were written to the newspaper, again, in that research, by women, but not identified as women. And I presented on Angelique Martin, I think about a year ago, and she was actually submitting things to newspapers, but again, not being identified as a woman author. So there, she did have things published, but it didn't say. And there were some newspapers as well in other areas that were being run by women. Not a lot, but a few. Okay, thank you all so very much.